Welcome back to Normal Island Live. I'm Curtis Daly. I'm your host this evening, and I'm joined by regular guest and friend of the show, Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, I'm always thrilled to have you on. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well, actually. I had a nice, relaxing day. Did some editing this morning, but just been chilling out after a pretty busy weekend and looking forward to the show tonight.
Well, I'm glad you're relaxing because you definitely do a lot of work, put out a lot of content. I must say, I love your top as well. Looks very good.
Thank you.
We're all stylish here on Turn Left.
Only a £4 from Primark.
Oh, that is a bargain. I love that. Now, before we start the show, please make sure you leave a comment. We will be reading some of them out. And if you want yours read, then make sure you let us know your thoughts. Now, the stories we will be covering tonight. Labour received a £4 million donation from a hedge fund in the Cayman Islands. Starmer less popular than Rishi Sunak. Israel kills 182 in Lebanon. And nurses reject the government's offer of a 5.5% increase. Now, let's go to our first story. So it has been revealed that Labour received a £4 million donation, its highest amount ever, from Quadrature Capital, a hedge fund based in the tax-dodging Cayman Islands. The Labour Party's largest ever donation came from a Cayman Islands registered hedge fund with shares worth hundreds of millions of pounds in fossil fuels, private health firms, arms manufacturers and asset managers. But that's not the biggest story here. In fact, it seems that Labour tried to hide this donation from the public. Electoral Commission records suggest Labour received the donation in the 1 week window between former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announcing the general election and the start of the pre-roll reporting period, in which all political donations of £11,180 had to be published weekly rather than the quarterly norm. This means that despite being made on the 28th of May, Quadrature's generous donation was published by the Electoral Commission only last week, more than 2 months after Labour won the election. Neither the party, press office nor Number 10 responded to Open Democracy's questions on whether the timing of accepting this donation was intended to minimise scrutiny and critical coverage during the election. Now, despite Labour claiming they are the party of service, a clean government, which is a break from the scandal-ridden Tories, these past 2 months have shown that Labour have engaged in, more corruption than at least David Cameron in his first 2 months. Obviously, headlines last week were about Starmer's sugar daddy, his wife getting free clothing because, a combined household income of 200 grand isn't enough for a wardrobe, apparently. But it wasn't just the donation. It was that it wasn't declared. Now, Starmer and his front bench, downplayed it, saying, well, he followed the rules and this was just one little slip-up or one little detail he missed. But it seems like there's quite a lot of slip-ups from Starmer and his team when it comes to declaring large amounts of money. Labour members, as a result, had no idea at the time of voting that Starmer had been funded with large donations from the likes of wealthy millionaires like Martin Taylor and Sir Trevor Chin and Baron Wahid Ali, the latter now at the centre of a furor about Starmer's acceptance of gratuities. Investigative journalist Paul Holden told Open Democracy that a fine was issued by the Electoral Commission to Starmerite think tank Labour Together in 2021 for its failure to declare donations worth more than $800,000, including $730,000 received whilst it was under the directorship of Starmer's key advisor and Number 10's Director of Political Strategy, Morgan McSweeney. Now, the question of freebies hasn't stopped, as 2 cabinet members, Darren Jones and Bridget Philipson, were asked why they accepted free Taylor Swift concert tickets despite earning over $100,000 per year. First up, Bridget Philipson.
You are in a privileged position as a Member of Parliament. You will sometimes be offered the opportunity to go to events such as Wimbledon. I was invited as Education Secretary. Shadow ministers are often given similar invitations, and government ministers are often given such invitations. It was declared. I appreciate it is a privilege to be there, but I was very much there in my role as Education Secretary.
What about Taylor Swift?
Look, I'll be honest, it was a hard one to turn down. I appreciate there was big demand for the tickets. It was a privilege to be there. One of my children, was a keen to go along. It's hard to say no if you're offered tickets in those circumstances, but it was declared. I've been clear about that, but I do recognise that, you know, I'm in a fortunate position to be able to receive it.
It was a hard one to turn down. I guess that's all right then. Again, not sure why she can't pay for her home tickets. Now, the same question was given to Darren Jones and was asked whether he'd do it again.
You received a gift, apparently, of nearly £3,500 of tickets and hospitality to the Taylor Swift concert. Was that right?
Well, I was offered them. I had not seen my children for the election period. I thought it was a nice treat for them. I confess I'm not really a Swiftie. I went in my suit, as was well known. But I took my kids to that. It was a nice treat for them, and I declared it in the proper way. As you know from my declarations, that's the main big donation that I took, and I thought it was a nice thing to do for my kids.
Should you have taken it? I understand the premise that you've explained, but should you have taken it on the basis of what people like Rachel are saying?
It was an evening I had free when I had the kids in London. It was a nice thing for them to do.
Would you do it again?
In those circumstances, yes. I think what you have to be clear of is about the contrast between doing a nice thing for my kids, where yes, I get a perk. I'm sure I was offered them because I'm a cabinet minister, but I declared it in the proper way. There's a difference between that and when undercover journalists and leaks had to expose parties in Downing Street and corrupt COVID contracts with the donors of the Tory party. This Labour Party has declared, in line with the rules, transparently, any political donations that we've received. They've explained how they've been spent. That is very, very different to the cover-ups we saw from the last Conservative government.
Now, when politicians speak, don't pay too much attention to the things they want you to hear. You want to pay a special attention to the throwaway comments. One of them was, oh, it was a nice thing. And, you know, it was given to me because it's a perk because I'm a cabinet minister. Precisely. It's because you're a cabinet minister. Why may that be? But that's Darren Jones saying that he'd do it again because, oh, it's nice for the kids. He then goes on to explain there's a difference between bribery when it's COVID contracts and Taylor Swift tickets. Now, to me, bribery is bribery, but just because the Tories do something bad doesn't mean it exonerates Labour. Yes, even if one is clearly worse than the other, doesn't make it okay. But of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, it isn't just tickets, it's millions of pounds in donations. Helena, Labour talks about being for working people, but they took £4 million from a hedge fund that has shares in fossil fuels, arms, and private healthcare firms based in the Cayman Islands, notoriously known for not paying their taxes, and sneakily timed it so it wasn't revealed until after the election. I want to get your response.
I mean, it's just clear. I mean, we've been open on this channel, probably along the left. We've been very clear throughout the election cycle. We didn't need this very specific donation to be able to pinpoint that the Labour Party isn't actually there in the interest of working people anymore. It's been wholly subsumed by capital interests. That information about, for example, the donation that Labour Together have been getting, the ones that were flouted the Electoral Commission's rules and they were reprimanded for, that's been information that's been in the public domain for years now. There's been years that's been open information that the public should know. Has the press bothered reporting on it? The Times reported it very shortly before the election, and most people seem to have picked up on Morgan McSweeney as a political character as soon as the election was over. It's very interesting that this information wasn't picked up at any point before it was relevant whilst it was relevant to the public. Soon the election happens, the landslide is over, and now we're getting all this reporting on all of this. All of the interests that are powering the Labour Party, all of the kind of people who have their ins with the Labour Party. Now, when it comes to this very specific £4 million donation, this is of course the absolute peak of the problems that we have in terms of Labour Party being bought out by capital interests, and the reason why they are happy to stray so far away from the kind of, especially pro-peace side that the left represents within Labour, when they are directly being funded by those who have material interests in the proliferation of arms. It shows you why they're not seeing the same light as we are with regards to international conflict. And on top of that, we are looking at the current Labour Party conference, where we're seeing talks sponsored by all of these different companies with all of these links to all of these disreputable parts of the economy. And this doesn't seem like it's worth reporting on for so many areas of the press. Now, far be it from me to say that it's unworthy of criticism that we should be scrutinizing free gifts. And I think that it's a little bit grubby, especially the kind of Wahid Ali-based gifts like the clothes being bought for Keir Starmer and being bought for him for his wife, and trying to equivocate that with just how bad the £4 million donation is. But it's very interesting that our press chooses to focus. It chooses to create a public spectacle out of whether or not Darren Jones and Bridget Philipson have received Taylor Swift tickets. Now, I think it's embarrassing they threw their own children under the bus to defend themselves, but I don't actually give a shit. I don't actually care whether they're getting Taylor Swift concert tickets, rather than, of course, I wish somebody else was going who had paid for those tickets and who really wanted to go, rather than getting it as free as a privilege for being a a member of parliament, for example. But this is peanuts. This is nothing in comparison to all of the people whose changed interests now represent what the Labour Party is doing when it's in government. This is the real story. And to me, it looks entirely like deflection from the mainstream media, that we focus on what is kind of not that relevant in terms of free tickets to the football, which people outside of the Labour Party also get, rather than actually scrutinising the changing interest within the party. Even before we knew about this £4 million donation, the biggest donation or biggest donor to the Labour Party in the run-up to the election was Lord Sainsbury. He donated more than any single trade union from a party that had previously always been funded by the trade unions up until the New Labour era, where, as we see right now, what was happening in the New Labour era, Labour conferences were just treated like showrooms for wealthy people to go there and get access to connections. Peter Oborne has talked quite frankly on places like Newswipe about the fixers in the background who are trying to link between big business and political actors, and they used conference as a place where able to do this. At conferences in the last 5 years of Keir Starmer's leadership, they had stands for Royal Mail, the actual PLC Royal Mail, to advertise themselves, whilst their own affiliated trade union, the Communication Workers Union, was in a dispute with the employer. If that isn't anything other than showing you explicitly where interests lie in terms of the Labour Party, I don't know what will. And one final point when it comes to Bridget Philipson, how everyone seems to be talking about the Taylor Swift tickets, yet people seem to be ignoring the £14,000 donation that was made by Wahid Ali for her birthday party. The press is reporting on this as if the scandal is the fact that Wahid Ali made the donation and that it was for a birthday party, whilst completely skimming over the fact that this was to wine and dine other members of the fucking media class. This was explicitly being done to invite journalists over. I'm sorry, this is supposed to be the fourth estate. They're supposed to be scrutinising you, not fraternising with you. And that just shows you that our mainstream media is completely unfit for purpose, because they do not see the real issues, because they only report on things that are convenient for them, rather than actually trying to scrutinise where wealth and power lies in this country. Otherwise, they would know they're partly to blame.
I'm glad you brought up actually the 40th birthday party, 14k it was, because you're right. It's not. I mean, first of all, who gives 14 grand to someone's birthday party? You don't just do it, and obviously. You're right. It's courting all the people in the media. Now, I mean, I've brought this up multiple times, and I keep bringing it up because I think it's so important. But I was speaking to somebody who had it on good authority that they were talking to Guardian journalists, and this is before the election. And the question was asked, why are you so soft on the Labour Party and especially Keir Starmer? And they outright admitted it. They said, we want access. And now it gets to the point, well, the election's over, but they want that continued access. It's not just a one-time thing. It's not like, right, okay, now they're in power, now we're going to hold them to account. No, it's not going to work like that. I mean, we even know that Labour conference, how they're shutting out journalists. They will do it. And you mentioned the media. Of course, the media has a huge role in this. I mean, when we first covered the clothing given to Victoria Starmer, the freebies, right? The way that the media didn't ignore it, the media did report it, but the way they reported it was, it was like a kind of advice from Keir Starmer, and it was the focus was on the actual clothing, not the sort of reason behind it. It's like, oh, look at Starmer getting free clothes, what an arsehole. Sure, I agree, but the question wasn't asked, but why was that given? And the wider question wasn't asked, what about all the other freebies? What about all the other money going into the Labour Party? I mean, there was talks about a policy on, taxing tech giants. And then half the shadow cabinet got given freebies from Google. And within days, there was a U-turn on the tax policy. This is the important point here, which you're right, the media does not cover. They don't ignore it, but the angle on it is not important. It is a distraction. And I think, the Taylor Swift angle, the journalists, what they ask is it appropriate? I mean, I would say it's not appropriate. But that's not the question here. The question should be, why are MPs allowed to do it in the first place? I mean, civil servants have far more restrictive access to freebies. Why aren't the Prime Minister and people who change our laws? So you're absolutely right in calling out the media in this, because they are the biggest hypocrites of it all. But I guess my question is, given, I mean, you've seen that clip with both Philipson and Jones, their answer was atrocious. I mean, Philipson looks like she was almost laughing, and it felt like they didn't even care. They could get away with it. So, I mean, do you think they're even worried about this story, or they feel so entitled that it doesn't even matter to them?
I don't think they're worried about this story. I think that this will probably just blow over. It's in the early days of the government. I think if they treat it like a non-issue, they probably will just allow it to get over with. I mean, I think people will just end up accepting that these donations are just a thing that's going to happen. I don't think we should accept that. And the public broadly agree with me on this one too. It was polled, and I think like 80%, Stats for Lefty shared this on Twitter, saying that 80% of people polled in the public, or around those numbers, if I remember correctly, so that they think that political donations and gifts should just be banned for wholesale, gifts at the very least, right? Gifts in terms of wanting back, scratching back, etc. And I broadly agree with this, but I think most people will just essentially get to the point when they realize, well, actually politicians are all the same, and any scrutiny that we do is going to go completely unheeded because they treat it as such. And which is funny to me too is that, again, we have all of this scrutiny of the Labour Party, and rightful scrutiny too, correct scrutiny of the kind of deals that are happening in the background to be able to facilitate these gifts. Yet for years and years and years, this same thing happened in Conservative Party headquarters. The Tories have been doing this stuff since time immemorial. They've been the political wing of the business class forever. And now it's only that Labour are mimicking them that it becomes an issue specifically for the Labour Party. It's interesting that the journalists, while rightly picking up the story of people receiving gifts in the background right now, it's interesting that they only decided to pick it up as soon as the Labour government was elected. And so it makes, again, because they want you to think that there is no other option other than political parties who accept gifts and donation from big business, and paint the Conservatives as being the ones who are not acting out of order when they clearly have done. When, of course, if they actually wanted to report on things, maybe they should get people on, like, I don't know, John McDonnell, for example, checked his list of register of interest. It was just 5 donations from trade unions. No parties paid for by Wahid Ali, no hospitality from Google, no free box tickets to Arsenal, no Taylor Swift tickets, because that guy is somebody who actually takes his role as being a public servant seriously. But when are we having any discussion about the people who aren't parlay to this, rather than trying to paint our entire political class like they're the same? I believe that the Labour right and the Conservatives are broadly the same, but there's no alternative being proposed here by our media class. And because our politicians know, people like Philipson and Jones know, that's not going to happen, they can get away by trying to brush it under the rug.
Yeah, and I think you're right. They probably don't particularly care about this story, but they would be far more worried, I think, about the £4 million donation, which is the bigger issue here. And the even bigger issue here, which I brought up at the beginning of this piece, is how it was timed. So there was a week period between Sunak calling the election and then obviously the rules come in. There's a week period where you can get a massive donation and it doesn't get called out until at the end of the election. I mean, I know this is probably just speculation, but do you think that was done on purpose? Or was it a coincidence?
Oh, yeah, I think it was, yeah. I absolutely think it was done on purpose. Like, why else would you do it in that very specific time period? Of course, again, this is speculation. You have to be really clear about this. But, I mean, when would be the best time, especially when it's the biggest donation in Labour Party history, and not just from any private individual, not someone who you could necessarily kind of self-rationalise as being somebody who just wants to be a philanthropist. No, this was a hedge fund that's based in a tax dodging Cayman Islands. That's where they're domiciled for tax purposes. And they have interests, financial interests, in some of the most unscrupulous industries in the world. Yeah, of course they want to have their donation look like it's been... They don't want that scrutinised in the run-up to the election period, neither Labour nor the hedge fund in question.
I mean, Wes Streeton was asked that question. One journalist did ask him at conference, and he said, "Well, it's generosity, it's philanthropy." Okay, there do exist very rich people who are philanthropists, right? But this is a hedge fund with its money in private healthcare, arms, fossil fuels. Like, They didn't give 4 million. No one gives 4 million quid for no reason. How stupid do they think we are? And that's where you can correlate the link to the green industrial policy, the prosperity plan, being massively watered down. Or when it comes to workers' rights, you're seeing that being watered down. Because at the end of the day, as we all say, it's basic class analysis. There are two sides to this. There are the boss class, there are the workers. Labour is supposed to be on the side of workers, but as soon as money gets involved, they're going to stand on the side of the bosses. Yet Wes Streeton will say, "Oh, it's just philanthropy." I mean, they just want a strong economy. That's what it is. It's crazy, and it completely legitimizes Darren Abbott's tweet by saying Labour is for the multimillionaires. And I don't know if you noticed, by the way, but there's been a lot of I would say probably Starmerite accounts that are doing a lot of what do you call it? You know, when you correct someone on Twitter. I've forgotten what it's called. You know, when you someone lies about something and you do a correction and it's underneath a tweet. My mind's gone blank. I can't remember what it's called. I mean, my producer's probably
Community
shouting
notes.
Community notes, that's it. Sorry, I just blanked. There's so many Starrites in the community notes trying to no, actually, but, and there's one that said, well, hold on a second. Labour's biggest donations come from unions. I'm like, well, that's actually not true. I mean, 4 million quid from a hedge fund, that is not true. And it doesn't also matter. I mean, look, even if trade unions were technically giving more money than, I don't know, dodgy people, right? That, to me, just signals, well, they're happy to take trade unions' money, but they're not going to listen to them. Because you can't serve both interests. It's either unions or private capital. If you take money from both, let's be honest, you're probably going to serve private capital. But let's move on to our next story. We are going to stick with the Labour Party, though. Keir Starmer's poll ratings have now dropped below Rishi Sunak's. Starmer's net approval is -26, putting him 1 point below Rishi Sunak at -25. Now, of course, Starmer won a landslide majority, and Rishi Sunak led the party to its worst defeat in decades. Yet Starmer, only being Prime Minister for 2 months, is less popular. But it gets worse. There's more bad news for Labour. Top pollster John Curtis believes Labour's historic victory in July was down to Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, not Keir Starmer or his party. Something that we, thought was pretty obvious. According to the political scientist and professor, Starmer's win was mainly because of the damaging legacy left behind by 2 of his predecessors. A series of unflattering polls have added insult to injury for the PM. Savanta found that 48% of Labour voters would consider voting for other parties if there was an election tomorrow. Meanwhile, More in Common found 1 in 5 Labour voters, which is 70%, regret their decision to support the party. The pollsters also found 3 in 5 people expect Labour to lose the next general election, and 52% of those surveys said they did not think Starmer would still be PM by the time voters go to the polls again. More in Common concluded that Labour could lose its whopping 167-seat majority at the next election without losing a single vote from the public if those on the right managed to group behind one party together. That would leave the Tories on 293 seats and Labour on 273, according to the researchers. More in Common's Luke Trill said, "Our analysis suggests a modest growth in their vote share to 36% is the magic number that would allow the party to see off a threat from a united right." Now, that's pretty astonishing. Nearly half of those who polled, who voted Labour, said they would consider voting for another party after just voting for them 2 months ago. Helena, this must be the worst start to a government maybe ever. I mean, can you recall a time when a Prime Minister and a government was so unpopular after 2 months in office?
I mean, I think you're right. I can't remember a time, especially in my lifetime, that an administration has been so hated so quickly. And what's interesting as well is I think I have a couple of things I want to pick apart from that More in Common research. This first one I think is really interesting stat that they found in actually half of those people, I think over half those people who said that they would consider voting for another party at the next election other than Labour, who voted Labour at the last election. Most of these people actually said they would vote for the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. So it's not this group of people who they were trying to win over from the right they were trying to win over Conservative to Labour switchers who are going back. This is people who backed them as part of a progressive alliance type tactical voting platform to get rid of the Tories, and that's exactly not what they want. What they got, and obviously we won them. We all won them here on the left in the run up to the election. We kept telling them like, no, they're not a progressive party. They're clearly not progressive. None of their platform stands for progressivism. If you vote for it, you're going to get right wing neoliberal politics, and that's what they've gotten. I'm trying to, you got what you wanted at the end of the day, but hopefully they'll be able to see the error of their ways and move over, just like a bunch of other people who backed them have been critical of them since they've been elected. The second point, though, I think is interesting, where Luke Shaw said, there can be some kind of united right to take on the Labour Party. This isn't happening. Reform UK's base, only just over a third of them are people who say their second choice would be the Conservative Party. Reform UK's base, a lot of this is in the north of England. Now, I think that might dissipate if they actually bothered looking at the kind of things Reform UK talk about, like, I don't know, supporting Margaret Thatcher when that's who destroyed northern communities, and why Reform poll better than the Tories, because they don't have all of the baggage that comes from being linked to the destruction of working communities in the north of England. But a similar amount of Reform UK backers say their second choice would be the Labour Party. This is shown from the kind of preferences that Reform UK voters have shown in Holyrood by-elections. Though there's a very small sample size, but I'm going from the stats we have in the round, from polls, from existing elections that we've seen. And Reform UK, again, around about even between second place Labour, second place Tory. These aren't people who are natural Conservative Party voters saying that there can be some kind of united right that's going to be able to bring together Reform UK dissidents, essentially, people who have decided to go against the political orthodoxy of the country and back this iconoclastic party attacking from the sidelines. These people are not going to go to the Conservative Party to try and beat Labour. That's not what they're there for. They're a completely different sector of the electorate. And of course, I think that any kind of electoral prediction about what's going to happen to Labour that tries to think of the right as being united is incorrect, because on top of that, the Conservative Party, if they try and unite with Reform UK, are going to lose their One Nation vote to the Liberal Democrats, just like they did at the last election, to an even larger degree. The right wing in this country are in a real rock and hard place that they're in at the moment, partially because Labour have parked their tanks on their turf by swanning off to Italy to go and have conversations with the ideological heir to Mussolini about immigration policy, which that's what the Conservative Party has usually been the kind of the party of in this country. But people who want kind of the Cameronist, like, not necessarily austere politics, but this kind of quote unquote sensible politics, which is not Labour branded, but is a little bit less reactionary, they're going to move over to the Liberal Democrats. There isn't an electoral base for conservatism, for traditional conservatism to flourish in this country. You either have to go full populist, like popular capitalism, like Nigel Farage, or you have to go for One Nation conservatism. But every single one of these avenues has an electoral flaw that the Labour Party will still be trying to exploit come the next election. Do I think they'll win the majority? Probably not. But is there going to be some ascendant conservative base that's going to storm their way to victory? That doesn't exist either. Hello? I think you're muted, Curtis.
Oh, sorry. Don't know what happened there. Went on a bit of a spiel then, and socialist audio. I was just going to say, I completely agree, because looking at that data, I mean, 48% of Labour voters thinking we should have voted elsewhere. I suspect a lot of that was on the left, not the right, and I suspect the mainstream media has gotten the data and learnt the wrong lessons, which is And part of that is because of the delegitimization of the left from the mainstream media, where they think, oh, it must be just a united right. I agree. There is really no united right at the moment. But that should mean Labour should be more worried, because they will hemorrhage more votes to the left, either the Dems or the Green Party. I mean, the Greens are a second, I believe, in 40 constituencies. They should be worried about them, but it looks like that they do not want to engage in those voters. They're still going right wing. I mean, since the election, we were told maybe Labour are pretending to be a bit more right wing. They'll pivot to the left when they're in government. They've only done the opposite. So they're not taking them seriously when they should. I want to ask, though, I mean, what do you think it says when essentially majority of people think Labour will lose the next election? I know there's only 52% in an elections poll, but at least a good significant chunk of people think that most people think Starmer won't serve a full term. Do you think that's significant, that these views of the public, in a way, kind of could manifest that scenario? Do you think it makes it more likely, given that people clearly don't have confidence in the government?
I mean, I think that the idea that Starmer might get his marching orders before the next election, I think there is plenty of credence to that narrative. I think it's reasonable to suggest that. Again, first of all, because of what we've been saying for a while, which is Starmer is a lightweight. He's a political lightweight. He doesn't have a clue what he's doing. He's been stuffed up there like an empty suit that has been essentially cajoled into this position from somebody who didn't want to get into politics, who reluctantly became an MP in 2015 to potentially be Ed Miliband's Attorney General if they won the election. Obviously, that never came to pass. To then be approached by Labour Together in the background going, we think you'd make a good Prime Minister. And then suddenly becoming like this political actor that he never thought that he would actually be. I mean, it shows in his interviews. He's much stronger and more confident doing speeches than he is having to be interviewed as a politician, because it's clearly not his wheelhouse. This clearly isn't what he's here for. He just had to be fed lines. Essentially, since they lost Hartlepool, the by-election, they've been told that the Labour right are going to tell you what to do, so ensure that you don't fuck up. And of course, this has all gone wrong because the public didn't actually want what the Labour right were putting down. So I think that the idea that Starmer might be ejected because of his unpopularity, if they think it's going to be an electoral problem for them, and replaced by somebody else from the Labour Together fold, a Bridget Philipson or a Wes Streeting, perhaps. Like, I think that's very much on the cards.
My money's on Wes Streeting, I think, but yeah.
Yeah, but will it cost them the election? Or I don't think that people thinking they're going to lose is necessarily true. I don't think people really understand how balkanised our electorate is. And whilst Labour have been very good at spreading their vote in the places that's necessary, everywhere else, apart from the Tories, who seem to have lost out everywhere, Reform UK focusing on the north, focusing on coastal communities, Greens heavily focusing on inner city, urban communities, diverse communities, clearly where the Corbyn Alliance is going to be kind of casting their eyes towards as well. Hopefully there can be something tactical between those, something strategic between those two electoral wings. And the Liberal Democrats have been targeting the southwest. The ability for Labour to lose the next election, they would have to have a catastrophic meltdown that would tear away their voter base, and specifically to the Conservatives as well. They can lose votes to Reform and lose some northern seats and maintain the majority. They can lose some seats to the left, to the Green Party, by losing some votes there. But they have to specifically lose votes to the Conservatives in all of these marginal seats where the Conservatives are the biggest of a kind of mixed opposition. And
Which
this
is
isn't
probably
happening.
the least
That's not going to
likely,
happen.
Yes, it's the least likely scenario. Definitely lose votes to the left, definitely lose votes to Reform. But given the catastrophic defeat for the Conservatives, I mean, they're not an electoral vehicle at the moment, so that does seem incredibly unlikely. I absolutely expect Labour to win the next election. I think obviously they won't win as big a majority. And again, I think that piece took some really interesting data and drew the complete wrong conclusions. But I look, we need to move on because actually we're running a bit behind, so we'll go on. But before we get on to our next story, I just want to say that if you like what we do, you can subscribe and share our content. Now, there are 5 of us contributing to Turn Left. At the beginning of the year, it was just me. The first 3 years of Turn Left's life, it was just me. And now that's changed to 5. But it's all still voluntary. And in order for us to dedicate more time to Turn Left, to increase the quality, to not have us muted and speak for a good 5 minutes before I realise I'm muted, and to become a fully realised media organisation, then it does require money. And you can do that by supporting us by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/supports. There you can support us monthly or give us a one-off donation. We really want to grow a socialist media alternative to take on the establishment commentariat. Lord knows how terrible they are, and they're only getting worse. And you could be part of the journey. But let's move on. After a year of tensions and the gradual escalation of the conflict between Israel and Lebanon, that came to a head last week after Israel committed a terror attack in southern Lebanon, remotely blowing up pagers and walkie-talkies, prompting Hezbollah to retaliate. Since then, Israel launched airstrikes into the northern region of Lebanon, which has killed 182 people. At least 182 people have been killed and more than At least 182 people have been killed and more than 727 wounded, including women and children, in Israeli strikes that targeted southern Lebanon, the health ministry said. The Israeli military said it struck 300 targets in southern and northeastern Lebanon as it steps up pressure against the Hezbollah militant group. They have unleashed the most widespread wave of airstrikes against Hezbollah on Monday and warned Lebanese citizens to evacuate areas where the armed group was storing weapons, moving closer to all-out war. We are deepening our attacks in Lebanon. The actions will continue until we achieve our goal to return the northern residents safely to their homes, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said. Now, interesting from Gallant saying that Israel's goal is for residents to return safely home. How to do that? By firing rockets into the area. Once again, the attacks from Israel further threaten civilians in the region rather than specifically targeting the militant wing of Hezbollah. Israeli warplanes have been carrying out extensive airstrikes in southern Lebanon by air raids on towns and villages. The Israel Defense Forces are warning of significant strikes in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon's northeast, which are reportedly now underway. This morning, the IDF through its spokesperson, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, said Hezbollah had militarized civilian infrastructure and turned southern Lebanon into a battlefield. So we have the IDF striking villages, yet they claim they are targeting militarized civilian infrastructure, which, by the way, something to be considered. Civilian infrastructure is when forces use the infrastructure, which could be anything, which is why extra precaution has to be taken for them to be a target. Now, the IDF's commanding officer, Daniel Hagari, made a statement before the strikes claiming that they were going to use precision in their targeting.
The IDF will engage in extensive, precise strikes against terror targets which have been embedded widely throughout Lebanon. We ask residents of Lebanese villages to pay attention to the message and warning published by the IDF and heed them. This is an advance warning for your own safety and the safety of your family. We advise civilians from Lebanese villages located in and next to buildings and areas used by Hezbollah for military purpose, such as those used to store weapons, to immediately move out of harm's way for their own safety.
Now let me ask, do you believe him? Once again, Israel lied, and now children among the 727 have been wounded. Helena, a huge escalation by Israel. Could we see a full-blown invasion?
I'm not sure whether we might see a full-blown invasion or not. It remains to be seen currently. I wouldn't put it past Benjamin Netanyahu to essentially want to continue this wider war for as long as possible. It's clear that they have essentially got the green light to be able to go ahead from the American government. No matter how many times the American State Department will say, no, don't stop. Make sure you don't do that. Don't do that. We'll be very angry if you do that, but we're going to do it anyway. Oh, well, okay. Well, here's all of the weapons that you need to go and do that. I think the escalation is in Netanyahu's interest because, of course, as soon as the war ends, so does his political career. So there's no interest for them in trying to have a peaceful solution to this when they could try and engage in as much conflict in the Middle East as possible, because the further it escalates, the further any kind of peace deal happens, either with Hezbollah, which seems unlikely at all, or indeed something happening in Gaza. the longer that they can run specifically on the idea of a coordinated threat to the existence of the state of Israel, the more that they can manufacture consent amongst the population for the continuation of military action. Because, of course, the biggest problem, the divide in the Israeli public over what's happening with the conflict isn't actually over how many civilians that you might kill in Palestine or Lebanon. The issue, as far as the Israeli citizens are concerned, is how do we get the hostages home from Gaza? That is the big political sticking point. There's a large portion of the Israeli society who wants the war to continue, and a large proportion who wants a ceasefire deal done so that they can have peace and the hostages can be returned. Of course, the second half of that, the latter, isn't forthcoming from the Netanyahu administration because, again, they have political reasons for not doing so. Now, whether or not that means that we're going to see even further escalation, as you say, towards an invasion of Lebanon remains to be seen. But there is a very easy way of ensuring that you can get villagers living back in the north of Israel, and that is getting a ceasefire in Gaza and ending the campaign of war crimes and ethnic cleansing that's been continuing for almost a year at this point, because that is Hezbollah's stated reason for the rocket attacks on Israel. It's the fact that they are doing so because of the actions of Israel in Gaza. If that stops, then the villagers can immediately return to Israel. Now, you can call Hezbollah's actions terrorism all of you want. It's clearly violation of international laws of striking people who are non-combatants in those villages in northern Israel. But where now we see that over 80% of all the missiles being flown across the Israel-Lebanon border are coming from the IDF, not Hezbollah, it shows who is being who's least interested in de-escalation here, and clearly it's Israel.
I absolutely agree. There's been multiple instances where people actually within the Israeli government, opposition parties, have said this is Netanyahu drawing it out for his own political reasons. But obviously, I think it just goes further than that. I think it's because he is a terrible human being full of hatred as well. But it's also really important to point out that, yes, most of the rockets been fired mostly by the IDF. Now, I've actually had some information come through from my producer. More information in regards to this conflict from the BBC. It was reported 7 minutes ago. The figure is now 365 people have been killed. Over 1,200 have been wounded. Among those are 24 children and 42 women among the dead. So we just saw a clip of the IDF spokesperson, or the general from the IDF, saying that this is all about precision targeting. I don't think that 24 children and 42 women being killed is specific targeting, just like the pages and the walkie-talkies. In terms of Lebanon, though, what do you think they're trying to do? I mean, it's very hard to speculate on this, I guess. But why in Lebanon? Why try and create essentially conditions where the world is turning against them? I know they're doing it to Palestine, but they've got their own propaganda reasons, which they've been pushing out. But why now Lebanon? Why aren't they doing specific targeting? It seems like it's almost against their own interest to be so callous and to be so murderous in their assault. And actually feels like I don't think it's likely, but it feels like we're leading up to World War III.
I mean, it's interesting that Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari did his message to the Lebanese in English. I don't think that's the language they speak necessarily in Lebanon, Daniel. I wonder if that's for other people and not necessarily for the citizens of Lebanon there. But
Yeah,
I mean, again, it just goes down to the difference between the interests of the state of Israel and the Israeli population and Netanyahu himself. When, of course, Netanyahu has clearly shown he has callous disregard. Even in objectively, for the existence of the state of Israel, whether you personally believe that it should exist or not, whatever your solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, there are plenty of pro-Zionists out there who want the Israeli state to continue and who rightly see that Netanyahu's actions are doing the absolute opposite of trying to keep that going. Mariv Zonsin, who works for I believe it's 972 and a couple of other Israeli left-wing publications, who's been very critical of the Israeli government. I think she's well worth follow. Really, really good journalist. Has been talking for a very long time about how Israeli society is really breaking down. And Gershon Baskin, who's an Israeli negotiator who's worked very closely with Hamas. He's very closely related with Ghazi Hamad from the Hamas Politburo. In the negotiations that he's had, has talked about how there is no end game for this. There is no the ways in which the conflicts have affected Israeli society, has broken down parts of Israeli society, is going to create irreparable tensions. This was going to change Israeli society irreparably in the future. And if it does lead to, what you describe as World War III, or a wider escalation of the conflict, those tensions will only run further, and we will see a real breaking down of what used to be a very united population between the people who want to have an unsteady peace, I guess. They may not want justice for the Palestinians, but they may at least want an end to the conflict, at least for their own citizens' interests. And the extreme war hawks who are so desperate to ethnically cleanse Palestinians or to create regional conflict that they were willing to throw their own hostages under the bus in Gaza, which doesn't seem like that's a recipe for a cohesive Israeli society, even once the war finishes, if it ever does.
Absolutely, I agree. Let's get some comments up. We've had a few in the chat. If my producer can bring them up on screen, we'll go to them now. Becca A, he's not going to stop these. The Israel government aren't going to stop unless someone stops them, and no one who can is. Precisely. I mean, as Helena said, Netanyahu wants to keep this war going on. It's in his own interest. It's in the interest of many people in the Israeli government to do that. And the only powerful people who can stop them won't. Right? The US won't do it. Let's go to another one. Sarah Jessica Farter, good to see you again. Great name. David Ben-Gurion spoke of his desire to smash Lebanon. This isn't just some Netanyahu aberration. Absolutely true. I mean, Netanyahu, to me, is a specific individual who I think is just a horrible human being. But he's not the only one. There are people within cabinet, there are people within the IDF, all have a lust for war. And I think a lot of them are motivated by hate, and that's very, very clear. So, yes, Netanyahu is not an aberration. There's many people who want to do this. Essentially, everyone is an enemy if they don't support the Israel and the conflict against Palestine. And if you stand up against them and they're within reach of you, they will smash you. That's what I believe anyway. Let's go to another. Solid and Faye, if it only costs a few tickets to Swifty concerts and footy games, maybe we should club together and buy ourselves a government. I've got a £5 I'll throw in. Well, I mean, if you're earning 160 grand a year, or if you're a cabinet member who's earning, 120 grand a year, a Taylor Swift ticket is nothing. I mean, they might say, well, I couldn't get hold of one because sometimes it might be quite difficult to get and they were already bought. But for me, I want my integrity. Even if I love Taylor Swift, or I have kids and they love Taylor Swift, and we tried to buy them, couldn't get hold of them on Ticketmaster or whatever, and then this wealthy donor goes, I've got some, want to take some. I would say to my kids, sorry, watch Taylor Swift on TV, because I'm not taking any donations from you. I think it's about integrity. If you don't like that life, don't be a politician. If Keir Starmer loves his Arsenal games and has to be in the director's box, don't be fucking Prime Minister. Simon Lee, it's blatant corruption, and Starver read out the Nolan principles to Johnson when he was in opposition. You couldn't make it up. Well, it's just how it's always been, isn't it? If the Conservatives do it, the Labour Party will attack them, and client journalists will do that as well. They'll say, oh my God, it's so terrible when Boris Johnson and the Conservatives do these things. As soon as Labour does it, though, it's fine for them, and for the client journalists again, it's not a big deal. Why are we talking about concert tickets when there are more important things going on in the world? I and Helena and you watching and everyone at Turn Left are consistent. We don't like it if the Tories do it. We don't like it if Labour do it. It's very simple. Jay, 8 years ago during the Panama Papers scandal, Jeremy Corbyn proposed the UK should impose direct rule on tax havens, including the Caymans. Interesting you brought that up. I mean, the Panama Papers was a bombshell and then nothing happened. If I remember correctly, I mean, Helena, is it right when Jeremy Corbyn said that he talked about the Panama Papers, people I think David Cameron was, his name was dropped in it, and he called him out, and then was it LBC said, now Jeremy Corbyn should resign? It was that one, wasn't it?
Yeah. They literally said, should Jeremy Corbyn resign over this issue? The second piece of LBC brain rot when they described his free meals policy as the nasty side of Corbyn's Labour. Real Corbyn derangement syndrome going on there. It's interesting as well that you described the Panama Papers as being a bombshell, because didn't one of the people who uncovered it get fucking car bombed as well?
I didn't know that, actually. I chose my words flippantly there, but no, I didn't know. That was
just shows what happens to you if you It just shows what happens to you if you challenge power, whether or not you're an investigative reporter or a Boeing employee.
Precisely. Edward Sexby, I think reform will gradually replace the core Tory votes until they merge or the Tories go belly up. I suspect the former. Let me hand that to you, Helena. What do you think of that comment?
I think a lot of the Tory membership are far more in line with Reform UK values broadly than they are with the kind of the broad consensus of the Conservative Party trying to ally with this uneasy coalition of One Nation Tories when all of the like genuine wingnuts, like the real people who have got brain rot, I think they should migrate over to Reform UK. It clearly represents them more than the Conservative Party does, and the Tories should just try and court the Liberal Democrat vote. I don't think, again, I just don't think there's an electoral success story for the Conservative Party that doesn't include a movement to the centre rather than to the right, because Reform UK have got that shit on lockdown. They've got that wrapped up. So I don't really see any potential. Yeah, there's no electoral coalition left for the Tories, and thankfully that's true, especially as their core vote is older people who mostly vote for them out of habit, out of force of habit, rather than because they necessarily are gravitating towards their role in government. And that demographic, unfortunately, is leaving the electorate pretty quickly.
I mean, did you see the conference? How diverse they looked? It's very interesting.
I did. We watched some very funny clips of the Reform UK conference. It was very weird. But one thing that really struck me about the Reform UK conference was we watched a speech by Rupert Lowe, who's like a banker, who gone on and on in his speech about how the Financial Services Act was terrible for making our capital markets less competitive. No one gives a shit. Audience could not give a shit. As soon as he started talking about like culture war bollocks that we're all sick of, immediate rounds of applause. I'm just like, get some real problems. That's the main thing I took away from this. These people have no real problems. Politics Joe did interviews outside. What do they care about? Fucking pride flags. And I'm like, come on. Do you have any comments about like macro policy on the economy at all? Workers' rights? No. It's just anti-woke culture war bollocks. They have no real problems.
But ironically, the things he was saying about that, people should be listening to, because I describe reform as just a bunch of rich men moaning, and they are going to moan about the fact that, oh, you know, we attack rich people, and basically a lot of the reform people are rich. The MPs are rich. I mean, was it Rupert Lowe who used to be Goldman Sachs? Am I getting mixed up? I'm not sure. But anyway, that's the thing they're being truthful about, and then they're obviously blindsiding people with wokeism, and people listening to that. I was like, no, listen to the first thing they said. They don't like it when, I don't know, we try and change the economic system to something a bit more equitable. But you're largely right. I mean, I also made this point that 99% of the Reform Conference was nothing to do with macroeconomic politics. It was nothing to do with material needs, nothing about the actual working class. It was just all nonsense. Now, is
it's
that
interesting
all for
as
our
well.
comments?
Yeah,
go on. You carry
it's interesting
on,
as well. When it comes to the talk about workers' rights, they didn't really talk about like employees. They talked a lot about the self-employed. They talked a lot about independent contractors. They talked a lot about like small business owners, in that they one of the biggest cheers were for us abolishing IR35, which reminds me of a Leon Trotsky quote, which is, not every petite bourgeois ended up being a disciple of Hitler, but there is a particle of Hitler in every member of the petite bourgeois.
So that's where the Hitler particles come from. I didn't know that.
It is. It's a Trotsky quote, yeah.
Thank you, Trotsky. I mean, I'm learning something new every day. Thank you. We will move on to our last story, because it is 25 to 9. Now, nurses have rejected the government's pay offer of 5.5%. 2/3 of RCM members in England voted against the current year's pay award, with a record high 145 members of the union casting a vote. In a letter to the Health Secretary West Streeting, RCN General Secretary Professor Nicola Ranger said, "We are witnessing a fundamental shift in the determination of nursing staff to stand up for themselves, their patients, and the NHS they believe in." Responding to the announcement, Mr. Streeting said in a statement, Labour understood what nurses have been through in recent years and how hard it is at the moment. For the first time in a long time, nurses have got a government on their side, he said, promising to work with them to take the NHS from the worst crisis in history and get it back on its feet. Shadow Health Secretary Victoria Atkins said in a statement the government should have expected this reaction from nurses after it awarded junior doctors an inflation-busting pay rise. Now, Miss Atkins criticised the Chancellor and Health Secretary for not realising their short-term decisions have long-term consequences. No surprise that a Tory is framing it as inflation busting for simply asking for a deserved pay rise. Interesting also that Wes Streeting has claims that for the first time nurses have a government on their side. This is coming from a Labour government enacting austerity and privatisation. But to be fair to the government, they have resolved other disputes, and maybe they expected the RCN to agree to the offer. But if you ask me, 5.5% is pretty paltry. Helena, what are your thoughts of the offer itself and the RCN rejecting it? It seems Labour are having a bad week.
Well, there's a load of different angles to this. Like, I want to talk about the right-wing reaction to this story very particularly. First of all, they describe it as being inflation busting. This isn't true. So I commented 2 years ago. Remember when we were having these discussions about industrial action between healthcare workers when the Conservative Party were in government, how they actually had no contact with the health secretary at the time, and they waited and waited and waited and waited, and then finally they declared strike action when they were getting no response. There was a very specific reason the Tories were trying to wait out the clock on this, and this was because they wanted the headline inflation figure that was previously, I think the highest was around 16-17%. They wanted that figure to drop down to being 5%, because again, it tracks overall increases over a 12-year period, not just how much prices are rising right now. That you need month-on-month inflation for that. They wanted to be able to take a headline inflation figure. So even though prices have risen, people are still 20%, 25, 30% behind where their real terms pay would be in 2010. Yet, because the headline figure of inflation is now lower because we've gone through the inflationary period, suddenly they can frame these pay awards as being inflation busting at current inflation rates, but not in terms of where pay should be had they had inflation busting pay rises since the start of the pandemic, when we really saw the inflationary spiral kick off in this country, which is why I hate calling it pay rises, because they're not pay rises, it's pay restoration. It's pay restoration, at least in some cases, not even close to pay restoration in other cases, especially
it's just
not
a pay
for the
cut
nurses.
still, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. In some cases, they're still getting a real terms pay cut since 2019, and especially since we had the public sector pay freezes in 2010 under the Osborne and Cameron administration. So for anyone to describe this as inflation busting is a lie. It's a total, abject, 100% lie. The second framing that you're getting is this idea that, oh, well, Labour are caving into their union paymasters. I'm like, no, they just are doing these things because the Conservative government spent more money fighting the industrial disputes than Labour have spent on solving the industrial disputes. When you want to talk about governments throwing away money into bottomless pits, that's called agency workers. That's called indemnifying the private rail companies, for example. What the Tories did for the entirety of the time that they were fighting the industrial action, i.e. letting the private companies off the hook, or indeed hiring private company agency workers to undermine the striking workers in the healthcare sector. So trying to paint this as Labour caving into union demands rather than just saving money because of course you would when given the option of spending more money to fight the strikes or fewer or less money to solve the industrial action. That's just normal prudence, right? I hate trying to describe the Labour government as being economically prudent because in so many areas they clearly are not. But in this one very particular area, if you're running on the idea of the Conservative Party being bad on the economy, because they are, historically, every single time they've destroyed the economy, every single time they've been in government, going back to the Barber boom in the 70s, all the way through Thatcherite deregulation to Black Wednesday to the austerity period, they've always been terrible with the economy. And in this case, Labour are absolutely doing the right thing in acceding to pay demands, and hopefully they'll go back to the table and negotiate a better pay settlement for the NHS workers at the end of all this.
Some people may be asking, why would the Tories do that? Why would they spend more money to not give the pay rises that nurses want? Because I thought they're so prudent on the economy. And the answer is they don't want to give power to these people, right? Of course, the Conservatives have always said, and the media goes with it, that we're better on the economy, we're prudent, we try not to spend too much. That's never been the case. They've spent more than the Labour Party. I think it was between when George Osborne became Chancellor. Was it between 2010 and 2013? I think they spent more in that government than every single Labour government combined. Labour governments typically spend less, actually, in many areas. But of course, it's not about expenditure. It's not about balancing the books. It's because they don't want to give power to workers. That's exactly why. They don't like that. Now, it is Labour have taken the correct approach. I don't think they're doing enough, but they've taken the correct approach with previous settlements, because you're absolutely right. It's cheaper just to do it that way. But I take umbrage at Streeting's comment by saying that this is the first time for a long time that nurses have a government on their side, because even if they do agree to a future pay demand, there's another issue at here. And it's the same issue why most people go on strike. And it's not always about pay. It's either about conditions or protecting the rights you've already won. And one of the ways to decimate people's working conditions in the NHS is privatisation and austerity. So when Wes Streeting says, well, we're on your side, clearly he's completely wrong here, maybe lying, because at the end of the day, even if nurses get a better pay rise, their lives aren't going to be that much easier given all the outsourcing and given that the government, does want to enact austerity.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And what's interesting as well, we have precedent for the unions being able to fight this. So I don't know if you'd seen this story, but I think it was about a year ago. There was a group of hospital porters who were employed by a private sector subcontractor who were represented by Unite the Union. And in part of their industrial dispute, they got the government to agree to take their contract back in-house rather than through the private sector. So if the unions want to demonstrate that they're on the side of working people, what they have to do, what they absolutely must do, rather than try and play this kind of nice game that they seem to want to play whilst giving the Labour government time to warm their hands in government. No, you have to hold their feet to the fire immediately. As soon as Wes Streeting starts talking about all these privatisation buzzwords like reform or modernisation, what we heard from the Conservatives whilst they were doing similar privatisation reforms. Yeah, we all know what the dog whistle there is. They have to put their foot down immediately and say, look, no. We have industrial power. We represent the workers that you're trying to disenfranchise through privatisation. If you try and force through the PFIs, PFI 2.0, public-private partnerships where the private sector has the majority share control, then we're going to put our foot down and we're going to engage in industrial action to do that. It's no point trying to negotiate these things with backroom deals. It's clear the Labour Party has no interest. They kicked the Unite motion about the winter fuel payment into the long grass at the conference today. And on top of that, they tried to undermine the unions at the National Policy Forum, where there was supposed to be a group effort in creating the policy platform. Were the members enfranchised on this? No. Were the unions enfranchised on this? So much so they weren't, to the point at which GMB and Unite representatives stormed out of the National Policy Forum dinner, and essentially it gave the Starmer Politburo carte blanche to set policy for themselves without the interaction of the membership or the trade unions, who are the biggest stakeholders in the party, far more so than the people within the tiny little clique at the top of the party, at least in where they should be. When actually now, as we've seen from political donations, the biggest financial stakeholders in the party, rather than one member, one vote, as it should be, are the rich. Are the multimillionaires, are the arms corporations and the hedge funds and the private equity firms who donate to Labour and Labour together.
As,
exactly.
John Caldwell himself claimed.
True.
They represent my commercial capitalists, and this is why I like the Change Labour Party.
Exactly.
Now, people, join a union, right? We don't have a government on our side, right? Obviously, the Conservatives never supported workers. The Labour Party, even though it's founded by unions, isn't going to support you. So the last line of defence we have is unions. And unfortunately, in this country, union density is very, very low. It's not recovered from Thatcherism, but we can fight back. So please join a union, because they are your last line of defence. And not only are they fighting for workers and wages, but they're also fighting against privatisation, because no one else will. As Helena, exactly. I mean, I didn't know that fact, but as you pointed that out,
exactly.
We will
and one last point. I'll add
please,
some stats there. I'll add some stats for that for the future TikTok viewers when this gets put up later. The union density amongst under 25s in this country is 9%. You think your job sucks? You think your terms and conditions sucks? You think your pay sucks? It's because young people have not politically organised. They have not organised in their workplace. The first step towards fixing this problem and trying to fight against the gig economy, which is going to be the biggest workers' rights fight of our generation, the very first step is getting organised and joining a trade union.
Bang on. Helena says join a union. We will leave it there. I want to thank everyone who tuned in, everyone who commented. We really, really appreciate it. And of course, I want to thank Helena for being our amazing guest. Remember, if you enjoyed this live show, you can support us by hitting that subscribe button. We've actually got 417 viewers across Twitter and YouTube. I expect most of you to hit that like button, if not all, or share us on Twitter. Now, if you like our work and you want us to become full-time, then you can support us by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. You can support us monthly or any one-off donation. My name's Curtis Daly. Thank you. We'll be back Wednesday for the Labour Party conference special. So make sure you tune in Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Thank you to everyone and see you next time.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn Left.